Lieutenant Sarah Chen had heard those words before, but they still stung like a slap across her face. Colonel Marcus Rivera stood behind his metal desk in the temporary command post, his weathered hands gripping a stack of deployment papers. The morning sun filtered through the canvas walls of the tent, casting long shadows across maps of the Afghan province where their unit had been stationed for the past 6 months. "She can't fight," the colonel had just told Major Williams, speaking about Sarah as if she wasn't standing right there in full combat gear. "I don't care what her training scores say or how many medals she earned back at Fort Campbell. This isn't a training exercise, Williams. This is real combat. And I won't have my men's lives depending on someone who might freeze up when the bullets start flying." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward, staring at a point just over the colonel's left shoulder. She had learned long ago that arguing with superior officers only made things worse. At 28, she was one of the youngest officers in their forward operating base, and certainly the only woman in a combat role. The path to this moment had been paved with countless hours of proving herself over and over again. Major Williams shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Chen's record speaks for itself. She graduated top of her class at Ranger School, earned her paratrooper wings, and has consistently outperformed her peers in every training scenario." "Training," Colonel Rivera repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can train a monkey to jump through hoops, Major. But when that monkey faces a real predator, instinct takes over, and women's instincts tell them to run and hide, not to charge into enemy fire." Sarah felt her hands clench into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain still. She had joined the Army 8 years ago with dreams of serving her country and proving that women could excel in any role they chose. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had initially opposed her decision, worried about her safety. Her mother had supported her quietly, knowing that Sarah had inherited the family's stubborn streak and wouldn't be deterred. The journey to this tent in Afghanistan had been anything but easy. Basic training had been brutal, with drill sergeants who seemed determined to break her spirit. She had pushed through physical challenges that left grown men vomiting and crying. Officer Candidate School brought new challenges, academic and tactical, but she had graduated with honors. Ranger School had been the ultimate test, a grueling ordeal that pushed her body and mind to their absolute limits. Only 3 women had ever completed the program at that time, and Sarah had been determined to be the 4th. But none of that seemed to matter to Colonel Rivera. He saw only what he expected to see, a woman who didn't belong in his war. "I want her reassigned to logistics or medical support," the colonel continued. "Somewhere she can contribute without putting combat soldiers at risk." "Sir?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "I request permission to speak freely." Colonel Rivera looked at her as if noticing her presence for the first time. "Denied. This discussion doesn't concern you, Lieutenant. You'll receive your new orders by the end of the day." The colonel turned back to his papers, dismissing them both with a wave of his hand. Major Williams gestured for Sarah to follow him outside. The Afghan heat hit them immediately as they stepped from the air-conditioned tent into the blazing afternoon sun. The forward operating base sprawled around them, a collection of temporary buildings, tents, and defensive positions carved out of the harsh landscape. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Major Williams said once they were out of earshot. "I tried to change his mind, but Rivera's old school. He fought in Iraq during the invasion, lost some good friends. He's convinced that having women in combat units creates more problems than it solves." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She understood trauma and loss, but she couldn't accept that her gender automatically made her a liability. "How long do I have?" "Transport to the main base is scheduled for tomorrow morning. You'll be reassigned to the medical unit there." The medical unit. Sarah had nothing against the medics. They did essential, life-saving work. But she had trained for combat operations, not to organize supply shipments or tend to routine injuries. She had come here to lead soldiers, to make a difference in the field where it mattered most. As Major Williams walked away, Sarah stood alone in the scorching heat, watching the daily rhythm of the base continue around her. Soldiers cleaned weapons, conducted briefings, and prepared for the night's patrol missions. These were her soldiers, men she had trained with and grown to respect. They had initially been skeptical of her leadership, but over the past months, she had earned their trust through competence and dedication. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez approached her, his face grim. "Ma'am, is it true? Are they shipping you out?" Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran, a man who had served multiple deployments and seen more combat than most soldiers ever would. When Sarah had first arrived, he had been among the most doubtful of her abilities. But she had won him over by outworking everyone around her, by knowing every detail of their mission parameters, and by never asking her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do herself. "Looks that way, Sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice carefully neutral. "That's bullshit, ma'am," Rodriguez said bluntly. "You're the best officer I've served under in 5 years. The colonel's making a mistake." Other soldiers had begun to gather nearby, drawn by the conversation. Corporal Jackson, barely 19 years old and on his first deployment, looked confused and upset. Private Martinez, who had struggled with homesickness until Sarah had taken time to mentor him, shook his head in disgust. "What about tonight's patrol?" Corporal Jackson asked. "You were supposed to lead the reconnaissance mission to the village." Sarah had been looking forward to that mission. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgents were using the village as a staging area for attacks on coalition forces. It was exactly the kind of operation she had trained for, requiring careful planning, tactical awareness, and strong leadership. Now someone else would lead her soldiers into potential danger. "Lieutenant Morrison will take over," she said, referring to a young officer who had arrived just 2 weeks earlier. Morrison was competent enough, but he lacked experience and hadn't yet earned the trust of the enlisted men. The soldiers exchanged worried glances. They had been scheduled to leave at sunset, moving under cover of darkness to establish observation positions around the village. It was a dangerous mission that required perfect coordination and absolute trust between team members. "Morrison doesn't know the terrain like you do, ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly. "He hasn't studied those maps like you have." Sarah had indeed spent countless hours studying satellite images, topographical maps, and intelligence reports about the target area. She knew every building, every potential hiding spot, every escape route. That knowledge could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. "He'll have to learn fast," she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah returned to her quarters to pack her gear. The small room contained only the essentials: a narrow cot, a metal locker, and a small desk where she had spent many late nights planning operations and writing reports. On the desk sat a framed photograph of her parents, taken at her graduation from officer candidate school. Her father wore his old Army dress uniform, pride evident in his weathered face despite his earlier reservations about her career choice. She picked up the photograph, remembering the conversation they had shared before her deployment. "You don't have anything to prove to anyone," he had told her. "You've already accomplished more than most soldiers ever will. But if you're determined to do this, then do it right. Lead by example and never give them a reason to doubt your commitment." Now it seemed that her commitment didn't matter. No amount of training, dedication, or competence could overcome the colonel's prejudices. She carefully wrapped the photograph and placed it in her duffel bag, along with her personal gear and extra uniforms. A knock at her door interrupted her packing. She opened it to find Private Martinez standing in the hallway, holding a manila folder. "Ma'am, these are the latest intelligence updates for tonight's mission," he said. "I thought you might want to pass them along to Lieutenant Morrison." Sarah took the folder and glanced through its contents. New information had come in from drone surveillance, showing recent movement around the target village. There were details about possible IED placements and changes in local insurgent activity patterns. This intelligence would be crucial for mission planning. "Thank you, Martinez. I'll make sure Morrison gets this immediately." But as she walked toward Morrison's quarters, Sarah couldn't help but worry. The young lieutenant was bright and eager, but he lacked the experience to fully appreciate the subtleties of the intelligence data. Would he understand the significance of the movement patterns? Would he recognize the indicators suggesting a possible ambush? These were the kinds of details that could only be learned through experience, and Morrison simply didn't have enough of it yet. She found Morrison hunched over maps in the Tactical Operations Center, clearly overwhelmed by the responsibility that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. When she handed him the intelligence folder, his relief was obvious. "Thank you, Lieutenant Chen. I have to admit, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. The mission parameters are more complex than anything I've handled before." Sarah studied the young officer's face, seeing her own uncertainty from years past reflected in his features. She remembered her first combat mission, the mixture of fear and excitement, the desperate desire to succeed and prove herself worthy of her soldiers' trust. "The key is preparation," she told him. "Know every detail of the plan, but be ready to adapt when things go wrong. They always do." Morrison nodded earnestly, taking notes as she spoke. "What about the extraction point? The terrain there looks complicated." Sarah pulled out a detailed topographical map and showed him the best routes for withdrawal if the mission went sideways. She explained how to read the terrain features, how to identify potential ambush sites, and how to position his soldiers for maximum effectiveness and safety. As they worked through the mission details, Sarah found herself sharing knowledge she had accumulated through years of study and training. This was what leadership truly meant, preparing the next generation to succeed, even when personal disappointment threatened to overwhelm everything else. The sun was beginning to set when Sarah finally left Morrison to his final preparations. The base was transitioning to its nighttime routine, with different security protocols and a more subdued atmosphere. Tomorrow morning, she would climb aboard a transport helicopter and leave this place behind. Probably forever. She walked to the base perimeter, where guard towers looked out over the hostile landscape beyond the wire. The mountains in the distance glowed red in the fading light, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Somewhere out there, insurgents were planning attacks on coalition forces. Tomorrow night, other missions would launch from this base, led by other officers who wouldn't face the same doubts about their fundamental fitness for command. Sergeant Rodriguez found her there as darkness fell. "Ma'am, the patrol is forming up. They wanted to know if you'd see them off." Sarah followed him to the motor pool where Morrison was conducting a final briefing with the soldiers who would accompany him on the reconnaissance mission. The men listened attentively, but she could see the uncertainty in their faces. They trusted Morrison, but they knew him less than they knew her. When the briefing concluded, the soldiers began loading into their armored vehicles. Rodriguez approached her one last time. "Ma'am, I want you to know that serving under your command has been an honor. Whatever happens next, don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here. You've earned your place." The words meant more to Sarah than any medal or commendation ever could. These soldiers had seen her at her best and worst, had watched her make difficult decisions under pressure, and had followed her into dangerous situations because they trusted her judgment. Their respect hadn't been given freely. She had earned it through countless small actions and decisions over many months. As the patrol vehicles rolled through the base gates into the darkness beyond, Sarah felt a deep sense of loss. This was her war, too, her mission and her responsibility. Tomorrow, she would be reassigned to safer duties, removed from the place where she could make the greatest difference. But tonight, her soldiers were heading into danger without her, led by an officer who was capable but inexperienced. The thought gnawed at her as she returned to her quarters for what would likely be her last night at the forward operating base. She lay in her narrow cot, staring at the canvas ceiling and listening to the sounds of the base around her. Radio chatter drifted from the communications tent, and she could hear the distant hum of generators providing power to essential systems. Somewhere out there, Morrison and his soldiers were moving through hostile territory, following plans that she had helped to create but would not see executed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fought so hard to reach this place, to earn the right to lead soldiers in combat, only to be removed just as she was hitting her stride as an officer. The colonel's words echoed in her mind. She can't fight. Perhaps tomorrow she would prove him right by accepting reassignment without further protest. Or perhaps there would still be opportunities to show that his assessment was completely wrong. Sarah woke to the sound of urgent radio chatter bleeding through the thin walls of her quarters. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 03:47 hours. She had been dreaming of home, of the quiet suburban street where she had grown up, but the harsh reality of the forward operating base crashed back immediately. Today was supposed to be her last day here. She pulled on her uniform and stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The base was alive with activity that shouldn't have been happening at this hour. Soldiers hurried between buildings with purpose that suggested something had gone terribly wrong. The patrol that had left under Morrison's command 12 hours earlier should have been back by now, safely debriefed and settling in for some well-deserved rest. Instead, the Tactical Operations Center blazed with light, and she could hear multiple radio operators trying to establish contact with units in the field. Her stomach dropped as she realized what this meant. Major Williams emerged from the operations center, his face grim in the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the doorway. When he saw Sarah approaching, he didn't try to wave her away or suggest she mind her own business. The normal protocol seemed suspended in the face of whatever crisis was unfolding. "What's the situation?" she asked without preamble. Morrison's patrol missed their scheduled check-in at 0200 hours. We lost contact completely about 40 minutes ago. Their last known position was approximately 2 kilometers southeast of the target village. Sarah felt ice forming in her veins. She had studied every inch of that terrain, knew the dangers that lurked in the rocky hills and narrow valleys surrounding the village. It was perfect country for ambushes, with countless hiding places for insurgent fighters and limited escape routes for coalition forces. "Have we launched a search and rescue operation?" Williams shook his head. "Colonel Rivera is reluctant to commit more forces without better intelligence. He's concerned about walking into the same trap that may have caught Morrison's team. The same trap that Sarah might have been able to detect and avoid if she had been allowed to lead the mission as originally planned. But there was no time for regret or self-recrimination now. 8 soldiers were missing in hostile territory, including men she had trained and led for months. "What assets do we have available?" she asked, her mind already shifting into tactical planning mode. "We've got a quick reaction force standing by, but Rivera wants to wait for daylight before committing them. Says we need better situational awareness before risking more lives." Daylight was still 3 hours away. If Morrison's patrol had been captured or wounded, 3 hours could mean the difference between life and death. Insurgent fighters were known to execute prisoners quickly, often after inflicting terrible torture. Every minute of delay increased the chances that the missing soldiers would never come home alive. Sarah bit back her frustration. Rivera's caution was understandable from a military perspective, but it ignored the human cost of waiting. These weren't just soldiers on an organizational chart, they were individuals with families, dreams, and futures that hung in the balance. "I need to see the communications logs," she said. Williams hesitated. "Sarah, you're being reassigned in a few hours. Maybe it's better if you just—" "Those are my soldiers out there," she interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of steel that she rarely allowed to show. "Whatever Rivera thinks of my ability to fight, I know that terrain better than anyone else on this base. I might be able to figure out what happened to them." After a moment, Williams nodded and led her into the operations center. The large tent was crowded with radio operators, intelligence analysts, and senior officers hunched over maps and computer screens. Colonel Rivera stood in the center of it all, barking orders and demanding updates that weren't available yet. Sarah moved to an unoccupied workstation and pulled up the electronic communications logs from Morrison's patrol. The transcript made for grim reading. The team had reached their initial observation point without incident and had begun surveillance of the target village. Morrison's reports indicated normal activity patterns, with no obvious signs of insurgent presence. But Sarah noticed something in the routine position reports that Morrison had missed. The patrol had been maintaining radio contact every 30 minutes, as required by standard operating procedures. However, the signal strength of their transmissions had been gradually decreasing over the course of several hours, suggesting that they had been slowly moving away from their designated position. She pulled up a topographical map and plotted the patrol's reported positions against the signal strength data. The pattern that emerged told a troubling story. Instead of remaining stationary in their observation post, Morrison's team had been gradually drawn toward a narrow canyon approximately 1 kilometer east of their assigned position. "They were being herded," she murmured to herself, seeing the tactical picture with sudden clarity. "What did you say?" Major Williams had appeared beside her workstation. "Look at this movement pattern." Sarah pointed to the map where she had plotted the patrol's positions. "They weren't maintaining their observation post. Something drew them east, into this canyon here." Williams studied the data, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "That canyon is a perfect kill zone. Steep walls on both sides, limited visibility, only one way in or out." Sarah nodded grimly. If insurgents wanted to ambush a patrol, this is exactly how they'd do it. Create some kind of distraction or apparent opportunity that would draw the soldiers away from their planned position, then funnel them into a predetermined ambush site. "But Morrison should have recognized the danger," Williams protested. "We briefed him on ambush indicators and proper defensive positioning." "Morrison is a good officer, but he's inexperienced. In a situation like this, with his soldiers potentially in danger, he might have prioritized what seemed like an immediate threat over broader tactical considerations." Sarah had seen it happen before in training exercises. Young leaders, faced with apparent emergencies, sometimes abandoned careful planning in favor of immediate action. It was a natural response, but one that experienced officers learned to resist. The question now was whether Morrison and his soldiers were still alive, and if so, whether they could be extracted before it was too late. The canyon, where they had likely been ambushed, was surrounded by high ground that would allow insurgent fighters to control all approaches. Any rescue attempt would be walking into the same tactical trap. Colonel Rivera's voice cut through the operational chatter. "I want options for a daylight rescue operation. Send the quick reaction force in with air support and we'll blast our way in if necessary." Sarah winced. The colonel's approach was straightforward, but potentially catastrophic. A conventional assault on the canyon would alert insurgents throughout the region, possibly resulting in the immediate execution of any prisoners. It would also require significant combat assets that might be needed elsewhere and could easily result in additional casualties among the rescue forces. "Sir," she called out, surprising herself with her boldness, "I'd like to propose an alternative approach." The operations center fell silent as every officer turned to look at her. Colonel Rivera's expression darkened with obvious displeasure at being interrupted by someone he had already dismissed as unfit for combat operations. "Lieutenant Chen, you've been reassigned. This matter no longer concerns you. With respect, sir, those soldiers are still my responsibility until I officially transfer, and I may have identified the location where they're being held." Despite his obvious irritation, Rivera gestured for her to continue. The urgency of the situation outweighed his personal prejudices, at least temporarily. Sarah moved to the large tactical display and pointed to the canyon where she believed the patrol had been ambushed. Based on their movement pattern and the timing of their last communication, I believe Morrison's team was lured into this area and captured or pinned down by insurgent forces. That's speculation, Rivera replied dismissively. It's analysis based on available data, Sarah countered. The signal strength degradation, the deviation from their assigned position, and the terrain features all support this conclusion. She pulled up satellite imagery of the canyon on the display screen. A conventional assault would be detected long before our forces could reach the target area. The insurgents would have time to execute any prisoners and withdraw through these escape routes here and here. Rivera studied the imagery, his tactical experience overriding his personal opinions. Then what do you suggest? A small team insertion under cover of darkness. Minimal footprint, maximum surprise. Get in, extract our people, and get out before the insurgents can react. Absolutely not, Rivera snapped. We're not sending more soldiers into the same trap that caught Morrison's patrol. It wouldn't be the same trap if we approach it correctly, Sarah insisted. I've studied this terrain extensively. There are infiltration routes that avoid the main canyon approaches. A small team could reach the target area undetected. Major Williams looked up from the communications equipment where he had been monitoring rescue frequencies. Sir, we've picked up fragmentary radio transmissions that might be coming from Morrison's team. Very weak signal, but the encryption matches our equipment. What are they saying? Rivera demanded. It's too broken up to understand clearly, but someone is definitely trying to transmit on our emergency frequencies. This changed everything. If Morrison's soldiers were alive and had access to their radios, there might still be time to mount a rescue operation. But every minute of delay reduced their chances of survival. Sarah seized the moment. Sir, I request permission to lead a small extraction team. I know the terrain, I know the soldiers involved, and I can move fast enough to reach them before daylight. Absolutely not, Rivera repeated. I'm not sending the soldier I just declared unfit for combat to lead a high-risk rescue mission. Then send me as an observer, Sarah pressed. Someone who knows the area well enough to guide the extraction team to the right location. The colonel's face flushed with anger, but Major Williams intervened before he could respond. Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Chen may be our best hope for bringing those soldiers home alive. Her terrain knowledge could be the difference between success and failure. Around the operations center, other officers nodded agreement. Despite Rivera's official position, everyone present had seen Sarah's competence and dedication over the past months. In a crisis situation, personal prejudices seemed less important than getting the job done. Rivera was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between his principles and practical necessity. Finally, he spoke through gritted teeth. You'll go as an observer only. Staff Sergeant Thompson will lead the extraction team, and you'll follow his orders without question. Any deviation from the mission plan, and you'll face court-martial charges. Sarah nodded quickly, before he could change his mind. Understood, sir. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Staff Sergeant Thompson was a veteran Special Forces soldier with extensive experience in hostage rescue operations. He listened carefully as Sarah described the terrain around the suspected ambush site, asking detailed questions about approach routes, defensive positions, and potential escape corridors. The extraction team would consist of 6 soldiers, including Thompson and Sarah. They would move on foot through the darkness, using night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain. Speed and stealth would be their primary advantages. They had to reach Morrison's team before dawn exposed them to observation by insurgent sentries. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Rifle, ammunition, night vision goggles, medical supplies, and communications gear. She had performed similar preparations hundreds of times in training, but this felt different. Real soldiers were depending on her knowledge and judgment. If she was wrong about their location, or if she led the extraction team into an ambush, more people could die. But there was no time for doubt or hesitation. As the team gathered at the vehicle staging area, she could see the determination in every face. These were professional soldiers preparing to risk their lives for their comrades, regardless of the personal cost. Thompson conducted a final briefing, outlining the route they would take and the procedures they would follow once they reached the target area. Remember, this is a rescue operation, not an assault. We go in quiet, extract our people, and withdraw before anyone knows we were there. Questions? There were none. The soldiers understood their mission and were ready to execute it with the precision that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. As they loaded into the armored vehicles that would transport them to the infiltration point, Sarah caught sight of Colonel Rivera watching from the doorway of the operations center. His expression was unreadable, but she thought she detected a hint of grudging respect beneath his obvious skepticism. The vehicles rolled through the base gates into the hostile darkness beyond, carrying the extraction team toward whatever awaited them in the rocky canyon where Morrison's patrol had vanished. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that preceded every dangerous mission. But underneath it was something else, a quiet determination to prove that she belonged here, in the place where it mattered most. The landscape outside the vehicle windows was invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, but Sarah could visualize every hill and valley from her hours of studying satellite imagery and topographical maps. Soon, that theoretical knowledge would be put to the ultimate test in the unforgiving reality of combat. The extraction team moved through the darkness like ghosts, their night vision equipment turning the harsh Afghan landscape into a green-tinted maze of rocks and shadows. Sarah led them along a route she had memorized from satellite images, weaving between boulder fields and dry creek beds that would conceal their movement from any watching eyes. Staff Sergeant Thompson stayed close behind her, occasionally checking his GPS coordinates against the route she had planned. The other 4 soldiers followed in single file, maintaining tactical spacing and absolute noise discipline. They had been moving for almost 2 hours, covering rough terrain that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without Sarah's detailed knowledge of the area. As they approached the canyon where Morrison's patrol had likely been ambushed, Sarah held up her hand to signal a halt. Through her night vision goggles, she could see the narrow entrance to the rocky defile, exactly as it had appeared in the satellite imagery she had studied so carefully. But something was different now, something that made her stomach clench with dread. A faint orange glow was visible from somewhere deep within the canyon, too steady and bright to be starlight or moonlight. It looked like fire. Thompson moved up beside her, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you think?" "Vehicle fire, maybe," Sarah replied quietly. If Morrison's patrol was ambushed in there, their Humvees could have been hit by RPGs. The implications were terrifying. If the patrol vehicles had been destroyed, any survivors would be trapped on foot in hostile territory, possibly wounded and definitely outnumbered. The fire would also serve as a beacon, drawing insurgent reinforcements from across the region. Thompson spoke into his radio headset, reporting their position and the visual confirmation of fire in the target area. The response from base was immediate. Proceed with extreme caution, extract any survivors, but do not engage in prolonged combat that could compromise the mission. Sarah checked her rifle and adjusted her equipment harnesses. Whatever they found in that canyon, she was determined to bring Morrison's soldiers home alive. The colonel's words echoed in her mind. She can't fight. In a few minutes, she would find out if he was right. The team moved into the canyon entrance, using the rocky walls for cover and concealment. The orange glow grew brighter as they advanced, and Sarah began to hear sounds that confirmed her worst fears. The crackle of burning fuel, the occasional pop of ammunition cooking off in the heat, and underneath it all, the weak voices of injured men calling for help. They rounded a bend in the canyon and saw the scene of devastation that awaited them. 2 Humvees had been destroyed by what appeared to be a coordinated ambush. One vehicle lay on its side, burning furiously and sending black smoke billowing up toward the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. The second vehicle had taken a direct hit from an RPG and was completely demolished, its armored hull cracked open like an eggshell. But between the 2 wrecks, Sarah could see movement. Soldiers were alive in there, trapped by the fires and unable to move to safety. She counted at least 3 figures lying on the ground near the burning vehicles, with others taking cover behind rocks and debris. Thompson raised his rifle and scanned the surrounding high ground through his scope. "Where are the insurgents who did this?" Sarah studied the tactical situation, her training taking over despite the emotional shock of seeing her soldiers in such desperate condition. "They probably withdrew after the initial attack. Standard insurgent tactics. Hit hard, cause maximum damage, then disappear before reinforcements arrive. They'll be back at first light to finish the job." "Then we need to work fast," Thompson said grimly. As they moved closer to the ambush site, Sarah could hear voices more clearly. One of them was definitely Morrison, calling out instructions to his surviving soldiers. His voice was strained but steady, indicating that he was wounded but still functioning as a leader. "Morrison!" Sarah called out, loud enough to be heard over the burning vehicles but quiet enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention. "This is Chen. We're here to get you out." The relief in Morrison's response was audible even from 50 meters away. "Chen, thank God! We've got wounded and we can't move them without help." Sarah and Thompson's team approached the crash site carefully, weapons ready for any insurgent fighters who might have remained behind to guard their prisoners. But the canyon appeared to be deserted except for Morrison's survivors. The scene that greeted them was worse than Sarah had imagined. Morrison was lying propped against a boulder, his left leg clearly broken and his uniform soaked with blood from multiple shrapnel wounds. Corporal Jackson was unconscious nearby, his face badly burned and his breathing shallow and labored. Private Martinez was trying to provide first aid to both men, while blood streamed from a head wound that had matted his hair to his skull. But the worst sight was near the overturned Humvee, where Sergeant Rodriguez and Private Cooper were trapped beneath part of the vehicle's armored hull. The 2 soldiers were conscious, but pinned down, and the fire from the burning fuel was getting dangerously close to their position. "We tried to get them out," Morrison gasped as Sarah knelt beside him to assess his injuries. "But we don't have the manpower to lift that debris, and every time we get close, the heat drives us back." Sarah looked at the trapped soldiers, calculating distances and angles. Rodriguez was trying to stay calm, but she could see the fear in his eyes as the flames crept steadily closer. Cooper was younger and less experienced, and his panic was more obvious as he struggled uselessly against the weight holding him down. "We need to get them out now," she told Thompson. "The fire will reach them in maybe 10 minutes. Thompson nodded and directed 2 of his soldiers to begin preparing the wounded for evacuation. But when he moved toward the trapped men, the heat from the burning fuel forced him back after only a few steps. "I can't get close enough," he reported. "The heat's too intense, and the smoke is too thick to see what I'm doing." Sarah studied the situation, her mind racing through possible solutions. The burning Humvee was creating a wall of fire between the rescue team and the trapped soldiers. The heat was increasing by the minute, and soon the flames would spread to areas that were currently just barely tolerable. But there was a narrow gap between the overturned vehicle and a large boulder, a space where the fire hadn't yet taken hold. If someone could crawl through that gap and reach Rodriguez and Cooper from behind, they might be able to free the trapped men before the flames cut off that route entirely. The gap was small, barely wide enough for a single person. It would require someone to crawl on their belly through smoke and heat, working in near-zero visibility to move heavy debris by feel alone. One mistake, one moment of panic, and whoever attempted the rescue would be trapped alongside the men they were trying to save. "I can get through that gap," Sarah announced, pointing to the narrow space she had identified. "Absolutely not," Thompson replied immediately. "It's too dangerous. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Sarah insisted. "Look at the fire spread pattern. In 5 more minutes, that gap will be blocked by flames, and Rodriguez and Cooper will be dead." Thompson hesitated, clearly torn between his responsibility to complete the mission and his orders to keep Sarah safe. Around them, the other soldiers were preparing stretchers for the wounded and gathering equipment for the evacuation. But time was running out for the 2 trapped men. "I'm going," Sarah said simply. "Those are my soldiers in there." Before Thompson could stop her, she had stripped off her bulky equipment vest and was crawling toward the gap between the boulder and the overturned vehicle. The heat hit her immediately, like opening an oven door directly into her face. The smoke stung her eyes and burned her lungs, making each breath an effort. But she pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that Rodriguez and Cooper were depending on her. These were men who had served under her command, who had trusted her leadership and followed her orders. She couldn't abandon them now when they needed her most. The gap was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance. Sarah had to worm her way through on her belly, pushing with her toes and pulling with her elbows. Sharp fragments of metal and rock tore at her uniform and scraped against her exposed skin. The heat was becoming unbearable, and she could feel her hair singeing despite her helmet. But finally, she emerged on the other side and found herself face to face with Rodriguez and Cooper. Both men were pinned beneath a section of armored plating that had been blown clear of the vehicle during the RPG strike. The metal plate was heavy enough to prevent them from moving, but not so heavy that it had crushed them completely. "Ma'am!" Rodriguez gasped when he saw her. "I knew you'd come for us." Cooper was in worse shape, drifting in and out of consciousness from pain and shock. His leg was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, and there were burns on his hands and arms from trying to push away the debris that held him trapped. Sarah assessed the situation quickly. The metal plate was wedged against the boulder in such a way that lifting it directly would be nearly impossible with only her strength. But if she could find the right leverage point, she might be able to shift it enough for the men to crawl free. She braced her shoulder against the boulder and positioned her hands underneath the edge of the metal plate. "When I lift, you 2 need to pull yourselves out as fast as you can," she told Rodriguez. "Don't worry about being gentle with Cooper. Getting burned is better than getting burned alive." Rodriguez nodded understanding. Despite his own injuries and the desperate circumstances, he had retained enough presence of mind to help coordinate the rescue effort. Sarah took a deep breath of the superheated air and pushed upward with every bit of strength she possessed. The plate shifted slightly, but not enough to free the trapped soldiers. She adjusted her position and tried again, feeling muscles in her back and shoulders strain against the impossible weight. On the 3rd attempt, she felt the plate move significantly. Rodriguez immediately began dragging Cooper toward the narrow gap that was their only escape route. But as they moved, Cooper's broken leg caught against the edge of the debris, causing him to cry out in pain and lose consciousness completely. "He's out," Rodriguez reported. "I'm going to have to carry him." The problem was that Rodriguez was also injured, and carrying an unconscious man through the narrow escape route would be nearly impossible under the best circumstances. With flames spreading rapidly around them, it would be a miracle if any of them survived. Sarah made a decision that went against every rule of tactical rescue operations. Instead of ensuring her own escape route first, she helped Rodriguez maneuver Cooper's limp form toward the gap. The flames were getting closer, and the heat was becoming truly unbearable. "Go," she told Rodriguez. "Get him out of here. I'll be right behind you." Rodriguez hesitated. "Ma'am, I can't leave you here." "That's an order, Sergeant! Move!" Reluctantly, Rodriguez began dragging Cooper through the narrow gap, struggling to pull the unconscious soldier through the tight space while avoiding the sharp debris that could cause additional injuries. Sarah stayed behind, holding the metal plate up to prevent it from shifting and trapping them all. But as Rodriguez disappeared into the gap with Cooper, Sarah realized that the flames had spread faster than she had anticipated. The route she had used to reach the trapped soldiers was now completely blocked by fire. The heat was so intense that she couldn't even approach the opening. She was trapped. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. The fire was spreading in all directions, consuming everything combustible and heating the metal debris to temperatures that would soon become lethal. Her uniforms were smoldering, and she could feel burns forming on her exposed skin. But then her training reasserted itself. There had to be another way out. She had studied this canyon extensively, knew every rock formation and potential hiding place. If she could reach higher ground, she might be able to find an escape route that would take her over the canyon walls rather than through the fire. She looked up at the steep, rocky walls surrounding her position. There, about 20 feet above the burning vehicles, she could see a narrow ledge that appeared to connect with a series of handholds leading toward the canyon rim. It would be a difficult climb under the best circumstances, nearly impossible in her current condition with smoke limiting visibility and burns affecting her grip strength, but it was the only option available. Sarah began climbing, using cracks in the rock face as handholds and footholds. Below her, the fires raged unchecked, sending waves of superheated air upward that made each breath an agony. Her hands were burned and bleeding from contact with hot metal, making it difficult to maintain her grip on the rocky surface. Halfway up the cliff face, her strength began to fail. The injuries, the smoke inhalation, and the physical demands of the rescue had taken their toll. She clung to the rock wall, fighting against the urge to simply let go and fall back into the flames below. But then she heard voices from above. Thompson's extraction team had reached the canyon rim and were calling down to her, offering encouragement and advice for the final portion of her climb. Somehow, knowing that her fellow soldiers were watching and depending on her, gave Sarah the strength to continue. She pulled herself up the final few feet and collapsed on the canyon rim, gasping for clean air and trying to process what had just happened. Below them, the fires continued to burn, but Rodriguez and Cooper were safe. Morrison and the other wounded soldiers were being evacuated to medical facilities where they could receive proper treatment. Thompson helped her to her feet, his expression showing a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "I don't know how you did that, Chen. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah looked back down into the canyon where flames still danced among the wreckage of Morrison's patrol. 2 soldiers were alive because she had been willing to crawl through that narrow gap and risk everything to free them from the debris that held them trapped. Rodriguez would recover from his injuries and return to duty. Cooper would need extensive medical treatment, but he would live. The extraction team began the long march back to the forward operating base, carrying the wounded soldiers on improvised stretchers and moving as quickly as the terrain would allow. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of the flames she had just escaped. By the time they reached the base perimeter, word of the successful rescue had already spread throughout the compound. Soldiers lined the route from the main gate to the medical facility, standing at attention as the extraction team brought their wounded comrades home. Colonel Rivera was waiting at the medical facility, his expression completely different from the dismissive skepticism he had shown the previous day. As Sarah approached, still covered in soot and blood from her ordeal in the canyon, he stepped forward to meet her. "Lieutenant Chen," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my gratitude for bringing those soldiers home alive." Sarah stood at attention despite her injuries and exhaustion. "Sir, I was just doing my job," No, Rivera replied firmly. You were doing far more than that. You risked your own life to save soldiers under your command. That's the kind of leadership we need in combat units, regardless of gender or any other consideration. He paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to him. I was wrong about you, Lieutenant. Completely wrong. If you're willing to stay, I'd like to cancel your reassignment and keep you with your unit. Sarah felt a surge of vindication that she had fought so long to achieve. The colonel's words meant more than any medal or promotion could have. She had proven herself in the most fundamental way possible by placing the lives of her soldiers above her own safety. Sir, I'd be honored to continue serving with this unit. As the medical teams took charge of the wounded soldiers, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the pain of her own injuries. Burns covered her hands and arms, her lungs ached from smoke inhalation, and dozens of cuts and scrapes marked her passage through the burning wreckage. But beneath the physical pain was a deep sense of satisfaction. She had answered the fundamental question that had driven her throughout her military career. When everything was on the line, when soldiers' lives hung in the balance, would she measure up to the standards expected of a combat leader? The answer was written in the grateful faces of Rodriguez and Cooper as they were loaded into ambulances for transport to better medical facilities. It was confirmed by the respectful salutes of soldiers who had witnessed her actions and understood what they meant. Rodriguez, despite his own injuries, managed to grab her hand as he was being loaded into the ambulance. Ma'am, he said quietly, I want you to know that I've served with a lot of officers over the years. You're the best I've ever seen. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, careful not to aggravate his injuries. Just focus on getting better, Sergeant. The unit needs you back. The unit needs you too, ma'am. Don't let anyone tell you different. As the ambulances pulled away, carrying the wounded soldiers toward medical care and eventual recovery, Sarah stood in the morning sunlight and reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. Every training exercise, every test of physical and mental endurance, every moment of doubt and determination had led to those critical minutes in the burning canyon. The colonel had stated that she couldn't fight. But when the moment came, when her soldiers needed her most, she had proved that assessment completely wrong. She had dragged 2 men out of the flames and brought them home alive, earning their respect and her place among the warriors who defended their country in hostile lands far from home. The war would continue, bringing new challenges and dangers. There would be other missions, other opportunities to lead soldiers into harm's way and bring them safely home. But Sarah knew now, with absolute certainty, that she belonged here. She had found her place in the brotherhood of soldiers, earned through courage and sacrifice in the crucible of combat. The flames had tested her and found her worthy,